She'll die before she spend it all. Better for us if she goes sooner rather than later. I heard every word, even though he thought I was too far away to notice. Even though the room was filled with the soft rustle of papers and the quiet, respectful murmurs expected audible reading, even though my daughter sat beside him pretending to dab her eyes with a tissue as if grief had somehow made her deaf to the cruelty whispered inches from her ear. I didn't turn. I didn't react. I simply adjusted my gloves, smoothing the fabric over my fingers as if the words had brushed past me like a passing breeze. But they didn't. They settled deep, cold, and sharp right beneath my ribs. The lawyer cleared his throat at the head of the long mahogany table, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he prepared to begin, and I could feel all of them watching him, waiting, calculating, each person in that room already dividing what they believed would soon belong to them. My late husband had built a life measured not just in dollars, but in decades of discipline, of careful decisions, of sacrifices made quietly and without complaint. And now, only 3 weeks after we buried him, those same decades have been reduced to numbers on a page and expectations in their eyes. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. 72 years old, and they thought I was already halfway gone. That was the part that almost made me smile. Almost. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place meant to carry the weight of serious conversations. Yet everything about the room felt hollow now, as if respect had been replaced with anticipation. My daughter, Emily, sat to my right, her posture perfect, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled sorrow, though I noticed she hadn't once reached for my hand. Not once. Across from us, Daniel leaned back in his chair, just slightly, the picture of casual confidence, his tie loosened, as if this were a business meeting he already knew he would win. He avoided looking at me, which told me more than any words could have. People only avoid your eyes when they've already decided who you are to them. And to him, I was no longer a mother-in-law. I was a timeline, a waiting period, a final obstacle between him and something he believed he deserved. The lawyer began to speak, his voice steady, practiced, reading through formalities that sounded distant to my ears, like a radio playing in another room. I focused instead on the small details. The way Emily's fingers tapped lightly against the table when she thought no one was looking. The way Daniel's foot moved in a slow, restless rhythm beneath his chair. The way no one, not a single person, asked me if I was comfortable, if I needed water, if I was holding up after losing the man I had spent 46 years beside. Not one question, not one glance that held any real warmth. It was remarkable, really, how quickly a person could become invisible while still sitting at the center of the table. I shifted slightly in my seat, just enough for the leather to creak softly, and Daniel's eyes flickered toward me for a fraction of a second before darting away again. That was when I knew, not suspected, knew. This wasn't just greed. This had been building for a long time. The whisper I'd heard wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a conclusion, one he had already reached long before today. I lowered my gaze to my hands, studying the fine lines in my skin, the faint tremor that came not from age, but from something steadier, something far more controlled. People mistake stillness for fragility. They always have. They see quiet and assume surrender. They see patience and assume weakness. My husband used to say that the most dangerous decisions are made in silence, long before anyone realizes a decision has been made at all. I breathed in slowly, letting the air settle in my chest, grounding myself in the present moment, in the weight of the chair beneath me, in the steady cadence of the lawyer's voice continuing his reading. They thought this day would belong to them. They thought this room marked the beginning of their future. What they didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I had already begun mine days ago. And as I finally allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch my lips, I realized something else just as clearly. I hadn't come here to hear what was left behind. I had come to see who they had become. The lawyer continued reading, his voice measured and precise, each sentence landing with a quiet finality that seemed to echo against the walls. Yet I found myself drifting somewhere between the words, not because they were unimportant, but because I had already begun piecing together something far more revealing than any legal document could offer. Grief has a way of sharpening your awareness in unexpected ways, and in the weeks since my husband passed, I had started noticing things I once dismissed as harmless or temporary. The pauses in phone calls, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way Emily would glance at Daniel before answering even the simplest questions, as if checking for approval. At first, I told myself it was stress, that people behave differently when they are navigating loss, but now, sitting in that room, I could see it clearly. This had not started after the funeral. This had started long before it. The lawyer turned a page, the soft sound of paper sliding against paper drawing my attention back for a moment, and I noticed Daniel lean forward slightly, his entire posture shifting, alert now, engaged as if something important was about to be revealed. Emily mirrored him without even realizing it, her shoulders tightening, her breath held just a fraction too long. They were waiting, not for closure, not for remembrance. They were waiting for confirmation, for validation, for something that would justify the quiet calculations they had already made in their minds. I lowered my gaze again, allowing my expression to remain neutral, almost distant, the way people expect someone my age to appear when faced with complex matters. It is remarkable how easily people accept the idea that age dulls perception, that time somehow softens awareness instead of refining it. I listen more carefully now, not just to the lawyer, but to the rhythm of the room, the slight shift of chairs, the controlled breathing, the subtle impatience that crept in whenever the reading moved through sections that did not immediately concern them. No one asked about the memories attached to any of it. Not the house, not the business, not the years behind those numbers. Only the numbers themselves seemed to matter, and that, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. My husband had always believed in preparation. He used to say that people reveal their true intentions not when they are given everything, but when they believe they are about to receive it. I had not fully understood what he meant at the time. I do now. A memory surfaced quietly, uninvited but precise. 3 days before today, I had received a call from the bank. The woman on the line had been polite, professional, but there was a hesitation in her voice when she asked if I had authorized a recent inquiry regarding one of our larger accounts. I remember standing in my kitchen, the morning light coming through the window, my coffee growing cold in my hand as I listened. I had not authorized anything. I had not even discussed those accounts with anyone outside of my husband and our financial advisor. Yet someone had asked. Someone had tried to look. I had thanked her calmly, ended the call, and stood there for a long moment without moving. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to make me start paying attention in a different way. I did not confront anyone. I did not ask questions. I simply began observing. The following day, Emily had stopped by unexpectedly. She brought flowers, white lilies. My husband used to dislike lilies. He said they reminded him too much of hospital rooms. Emily knew that. She had always known that. Yet there she was, standing in my doorway with a bouquet, chosen not for comfort, but for appearance. She spoke softly, said all the right things, but her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, toward the study where we kept important documents. At the time, I said nothing. I made tea. I listened. I watched. And now, sitting in that office, hearing the quiet urgency in Daniel's earlier whisper echoing in my mind, everything aligned with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not a moment. This was a pattern. The lawyer's voice sharpened slightly as he reached a section that clearly held more weight, and I could feel the tension in the room rise almost instantly. Daniel leaned forward again, this time unable to hide his interest. Emily's hand rested on the table, fingers curled slightly inward, as if bracing herself. I remained still, calm, present, because the truth was I was no longer waiting to hear what was written in that document. I was waiting to see how far they would go before they realized that I had already seen everything. The air in the room seemed to tighten as the lawyer adjusted his glasses and shifted into the next section, his tone subtly changing in a way that only someone truly listening would notice. And I saw it immediately in the way Daniel straightened, in the way Emily's fingers froze against the polished surface of the table, as if the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Yet what fascinated me was not what was about to be read, but how certain they already were of its outcome. How completely they had convinced themselves that everything ahead belonged to them, as if ownership could be decided by anticipation alone. I let my gaze drift briefly toward the window behind the lawyer, where the late afternoon light filtered through in soft, muted lines, calm and steady, untouched by the quiet storm building inside that room. And I found myself thinking how strange it was that something so constant could exist alongside something so fragile as trust, something that could dissolve without sound and leave nothing but a performance in its place. The lawyer began outlining specific allocations, his words precise, deliberate, and I watched Daniel's expression carefully, the slight lift at the corner of his mouth that he tried to suppress, the flicker of satisfaction he could not quite hide, and beside him, Emily leaned forward just enough to signal her attention without appearing eager, a balance she had learned over time, though today the effort showed more than she realized. I felt no urgency to interrupt, no need to clarify anything, because the truth had already settled quietly within me, and there's a certain kind of clarity that removes the impulse to react, leaving only observation in its place. I noticed how neither of them glanced at me now, not even out of courtesy, as if I had already been moved out of the equation, as if my presence were merely procedural, something to be acknowledged but not considered, and that absence of acknowledgement spoke louder than any accusation ever could. My husband used to say that respect is revealed in the smallest moments, in the pauses between words, in the instinct to include rather than exclude, and sitting there I realized that those instincts had long since disappeared from the people I once believed I understood. Another memory surfaced, sharper this time, from 2 days earlier, when I had walked past the study and noticed the door slightly ajar, a detail so minor it could have been ignored, except that I never left that door open, not after years of keeping important documents secured and organized with care. And as I stepped closer, I heard the faint sound of movement inside, followed by the quick, almost rehearsed closing of a drawer. And when I entered, Emily stood there, her posture too straight, her smile too immediate, explaining that she had been looking for an old photograph, something sentimental, something harmless, and I had nodded, accepted her explanation without question, even as her eyes avoided mine for just a fraction too long. I did not confront her then. I simply made a note of it, the way one might note a change in the weather, something subtle that signals something larger on the horizon. Back in the present, the lawyer continued, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing forward, each sentence narrowing the space between expectation and reality. And still, I remained still, composed, because there is power in allowing people to reveal themselves fully before responding, in giving them the freedom to step forward without realizing they're being seen more clearly than ever before. Daniel shifted again, this time unable to mask the impatience that had begun to surface, his confidence edging toward assumption. And Emily mirrored him once more, her breathing slightly uneven now, her composure beginning to thin at the edges, and I wondered, not unkindly, how long it would take for them to recognize that what they believed to be certainty was built on something far less stable than they imagined. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly in my lap, feeling the familiar steadiness return, the same steadiness that had carried me through years of building a life, of making decisions that required patience rather than impulse. And I realized that this moment, like so many before it, was not about what was being given, but about what was being revealed. They believed they were nearing the end of something, that the reading of this document would close a chapter and open another in their favor. But I knew differently, and as the lawyer paused briefly before continuing, I allowed myself one quiet, certain thought, not spoken, not shown, but held firmly in place. They were not approaching an ending. They were stepping directly into the consequences of everything they had already done. The lawyer paused again, just long enough for the silence to stretch across the table like a thin sheet of glass, fragile but unbroken. And in that brief moment, I could feel the weight of every unspoken assumption pressing forward, filling the room with a quiet certainty that what came next would confirm everything Daniel and Emily already believed. Yet what struck me most was not their anticipation, but the absence of hesitation, the complete lack of doubt in their posture, as if they had rehearsed this outcome so many times in their minds that reality had simply become a formality. I let my eyes rest on the edge of the table, tracing the faint grain of the wood, grounding myself in something steady while my thoughts moved elsewhere, back through years that now felt both distant and painfully clear, years when trust was not something to be questioned, when family meant something unspoken but understood, something that did not need to be proven because it was simply there. I remember the early days of Emily's marriage, the way she had stood in my kitchen with a nervous smile, asking if I thought Daniel would do well in his new business venture, the way I had reassured her without hesitation, offering not just words but support, financial and otherwise, because that is what you do for family. You give without measuring, you help without keeping score, and I had done exactly that more than once, more than I ever spoke about. There were checks written quietly, conversations held behind closed doors, decisions made in favor of their future rather than my own comfort. And at the time, none of it felt like sacrifice. It felt like investment, not in money, but in people, in relationships that I believed were built on something stronger than convenience. The lawyer's voice resumed, steady and composed, pulling me back into the present. Yet the contrast between then and now settled over me with a clarity that left no room for confusion. I had seen the shift slowly at first, so subtle it could be explained away, the missed calls, the shortened visits, the way conversations began to revolve around practical matters rather than shared moments. And then, more recently, the questions that carried a different weight, questions about accounts, about property, about details that had never interested them before. I had answered carefully, never refusing, but never offering more than necessary, because something in me had already begun to recognize the change, even if I had not fully acknowledged it at the time. Across the table, Daniel adjusted his watch, a small, habitual movement, but one that revealed his growing impatience, his need for progress, for resolution. And beside him, Emily's composure continued to thin, her carefully arranged expression slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. They were close now, or at least they believed they were, close to something they had already claimed in their minds, and that belief had made them careless in ways they did not yet understand. I shifted slightly in my chair, the movement slow, deliberate, and for a brief second, Emily's eyes flickered toward me before quickly looking away, as if even that small acknowledgement required more effort than she was willing to give. That, more than anything, settled it for me. Not the whisper I had heard earlier, not the inquiries at the bank, not even the moment in the study, but this quiet dismissal, this decision to exclude me while I was still present, still aware, still entirely capable of understanding exactly what was happening around me. My husband had once told me that the most revealing moments are not the loud ones, not the dramatic confrontations or the obvious betrayals, but the quiet choices people make when they believe no one is paying attention, the decisions made in passing that expose what they truly value. I understood that now in a way I never had before. The lawyer turned another page, and the sound seemed louder this time, sharper, as if marking a transition that none of them could yet see, and I felt a calm settle over me. Not the calm of resignation, but something steadier, something rooted in certainty. Because while they were focused on what they thought they were about to receive, I was focused on what had already been set in motion, on the decisions made days ago, quietly, carefully, without announcement or display. I had not rushed. I had not reacted. I had simply prepared. And as I lifted my gaze once more, allowing it to rest briefly on Daniel, then on Emily, I realized that they were no longer the ones holding the advantage they believed they had. They were waiting for something to be given to them, while I was waiting for something to be revealed, and those are not the same thing at all. In that difference, subtle as it may seem, everything changes. The lawyer's voice carried on, calm and unwavering. But something beneath it had shifted, something subtle that only revealed itself in the careful way he began choosing his words. And I noticed it immediately, the slight pause before certain phrases, the deliberate emphasis where there had been none before, as if he were no longer simply reading, but preparing, and that realization settled over me with quiet certainty. Across the table, Daniel leaned in further, no longer attempting to mask his interest, his confidence now edging into expectation, while Emily sat perfectly still beside him, her posture rigid, her expression fixed in a way that suggested she was holding something in place, something fragile that might break if she allowed herself to relax even slightly. They were both listening now, truly listening, but not in the way one listens to understand, rather in the way one listens to confirm what has already been decided. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my breathing even, because there's a kind of clarity that comes when you stop searching for answers and begin recognizing patterns instead. And the pattern here was unmistakable. It had been building for weeks, perhaps longer, revealing itself in small, easily dismissed moments that only now connected into something complete. Another memory surfaced, this one from the afternoon after Emily's visit with the lilies, when I had taken it upon myself to review a few documents in the study, not out of suspicion at first, but out of habit, the same habit that had guided me for years, ensuring everything remained in order. I had opened the drawer where we kept certain account summaries, expecting to find everything exactly as I had left it, and for the most part, it was, except for one detail, so minor it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less familiar with it. A folder slightly out of alignment. Not missing. Not disturbed in any obvious way. Just not quite right. I had stood there for a moment, looking at it, considering the possibilities, and then I had simply closed the drawer again without adjusting it, without correcting the small imperfection, because sometimes it is more useful to leave things as they are and see what happens next. The following morning, I checked again. The folder was back in its original position, perfectly aligned, as if it had never been touched at all. But it had. I knew it had. And more importantly, I knew someone had realized that I might notice. That was when the uncertainty disappeared entirely. Not replaced by anger, not by fear, but by something far more controlled. Understanding. Back in the present, the lawyer reached another pause, and this time the silence felt different, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath, and I saw Daniel's fingers press lightly against the edge of the table, his composure tightening, while Emily's gaze flickered briefly toward him before returning forward, their connection silent but clear. They were aligned in this completely, and that alignment had given them confidence, the kind of confidence that often comes just before something unexpected occurs. I allowed my gaze to move slowly across the room, taking in each detail with quiet precision. The framed certificates on the wall, the faint reflection of light on the polished surface of the table, the way the lawyer's pen rested just beside his hand, unmoving for the moment, as if even that small object was waiting for what came next. My husband had always believed in layers, in building safeguards not just for circumstances, but for people, for the unpredictable nature of human behavior. And at the time, I had trusted his judgment without fully questioning the extent of it. Now, sitting here, I began to see just how far that thinking had gone. The lawyer adjusted his papers once more, and when he spoke again, there was a clarity in his tone that cut through the room with quiet authority, not louder, not sharper, but undeniably more intentional, and I felt a subtle shift ripple outward, reaching Daniel first, then Emily, both of them reacting not with movement, but with stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when anticipation meets uncertainty for the first time. I did not look at them. I did not need to, because whatever came next was no longer about what they believed. It was about what had already been set, into place, quietly, deliberately, without their awareness. And as I sat there, composed and silent, I realized that the moment they had been waiting for was finally here, just not in the way they expected. The lawyer inhaled quietly before continuing, and this time there was no mistaking the shift, not in his tone, not in the careful way he positioned the document in front of him, and certainly not in the way Daniel's confidence flickered for the first time, subtle but unmistakable, like a shadow passing across his expression before he could fully control it. "There's an additional clause," the lawyer said, his voice steady, deliberate, each word placed with precision, and I felt the room tighten again, not with anticipation this time, but with something far less comfortable, something closer to uncertainty. I did not move. I did not look up immediately. I simply listened. This clause, he continued, was added shortly before Mr. Whitmore's passing and reflects specific conditions regarding the distribution of certain assets. Across from me, Daniel shifted in his chair, his earlier ease replaced by a stillness that suggested he was recalculating, adjusting expectations that had, until this moment, seemed fixed. Emily's hand, resting on the table, curled slightly inward, her fingers pressing into her palm as if grounding herself, though I doubted she understood why she suddenly felt the need to do so. I lifted my gaze then, not quickly, not sharply, but with the same measured calm I had maintained from the beginning, and I watched them both as the lawyer continued, because sometimes the most revealing thing is not what is said, but how people respond when what they expected begins to change. In the event, the lawyer read, that any beneficiary demonstrates conduct motivated by undue influence, coercion, or personal gain at the expense of Mrs. Whitmore's well-being, their entitlement shall be subject to immediate revocation. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not loud, but heavy enough to alter the balance that had existed just moments before. Daniel blinked once, slowly, as if processing something that did not fit into the narrative he had already constructed, and Emily's gaze dropped to the table, her composure faltering just enough to reveal the tension beneath it. I remained still, my expression unchanged, because nothing in that clause surprised me. Not anymore. The lawyer paused, briefly, allowing the meaning to settle, and in that silence I could almost hear the shift in their thoughts, the recalculation, the quiet question forming beneath the surface. Additionally, he continued, the evaluation of such conduct shall not be based solely on overt actions, but may include patterns of behavior, financial inquiries, and attempts to access or influence the management of assets prior to this reading. This time, Daniel's reaction was not as controlled. It was small, almost imperceptible, a tightening of the jaw, a slight adjustment of his posture, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what I had already understood. Emily glanced at him then, quickly, her eyes searching his face for reassurance, for explanation, for something that might restore the certainty they had walked into this room with. But he did not meet her gaze. Not fully. Not with the confidence he had shown earlier. And that, more than anything, told me everything had begun to unravel for them. I folded my hands more firmly in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my breath, the calm that comes not from ignorance, but from preparation, and I allowed myself, just for a moment, to acknowledge the quiet precision of my husband's foresight. He had known, not the specifics, perhaps, but the possibility, the risk that time and circumstance might reveal sides of people that were easier to hide when nothing was at stake. He had prepared for that, and so had I. The lawyer continued reading, outlining the implications of the clause, the conditions under which assets could be withheld, reassigned, or placed under alternative management, and with each sentence, the room seemed to shift further away from what Daniel and Emily had expected it to be. Their silence was different now. Not confident, not patient, but cautious, measured. I watched as Daniel leaned back slightly, his earlier forward posture gone, replaced by something more guarded, as if he were trying to create distance, not physically, but mentally, from the situation unfolding in front of him. Emily's hands were no longer still. Her fingers moved lightly against the table, a small, repetitive motion that betrayed the tension she could no longer fully conceal. I said nothing. There was no need, because this was not a moment that required words from me. It required patience, the kind of patience that allows the truth to unfold without interference, without interruption, until it becomes undeniable even to those who had hoped to avoid it. And as the lawyer reached the end of the clause, his voice settling back into its earlier rhythm, I realized that the balance in the room had shifted completely. They had arrived expecting confirmation. Instead, they had been given something else entirely. A condition, a consequence. And perhaps, for the first time since they had taken their seats at that table, they were beginning to understand that they were no longer in control of what came next. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt measured, as if every person in the room had suddenly become aware that something invisible had shifted beneath them, something they could not quite name, but could no longer ignore. And I watched as Daniel's earlier confidence settled into something far more cautious. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his posture no longer open. While Emily sat beside him with her hands drawn closer together, her fingers lightly intertwined as if she were trying to steady herself without drawing attention to it. The lawyer continued speaking, but now his words carried a different weight, no longer just outlining distribution, but reinforcing the conditions that had just been revealed. And with each sentence, I could see the careful structure Daniel had built in his mind begin to adjust, piece by piece, as if he were trying to find a version of this outcome that still worked in his favor. It was subtle, the way he shifted his gaze, no longer fixed on the lawyer alone, but beginning to move briefly toward me, then away again, as though acknowledging my presence had suddenly become unavoidable. I remained still, my expression unchanged, because there is a particular kind of strength in not responding immediately, in allowing others the space to confront what they are only just beginning to understand. My husband had always believed that people reveal themselves most clearly when they are forced to adapt, when the plan they rely on begins to change. And sitting there, I realized that this was exactly that moment, the quiet turning point where certainty gives way to uncertainty, and where true intentions begin to surface without effort. Another memory surfaced then, not from days ago, but from earlier that same morning before we had arrived at the lawyer's office, when I had stood in my bedroom, looking out through the window at the stillness of the street below, holding a single envelope in my hand, its contents already known to me, its significance already understood. I had placed it carefully into my bag without hesitation, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of something already in motion, something that had been building quietly, step by step, without announcement. Back in the present, Daniel cleared his throat softly, the sound controlled but unnecessary, and I recognized it for what it was, not a need to speak, but a need to reassert some sense of composure, some indication that he remained unaffected, even as the situation shifted beyond his expectations. Emily glanced at him again, more openly this time, her expression searching, uncertain, as if she were waiting for him to restore the confidence that had guided them into this room. But he offered nothing, not yet, and that absence created a space between them that had not been there before. It was small, barely visible, but it was enough. The lawyer turned another page, his movements precise, unhurried, and continued outlining the implications of the clause, explaining how any concerns regarding conduct would be reviewed with supporting documentation, how patterns could be evaluated over time, how access attempts and financial inquiries could be traced and considered. Each detail was delivered calmly, without accusation, without emphasis, yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. This was not a vague warning. It was a structure, a framework, something that had been designed with intention. I allowed my gaze to rest briefly on the table once more, not because I needed to avoid looking at them, but because I did not need to watch their reactions to understand them. The tension in the room was no longer subtle. It had settled into the quiet spaces between words, into the pauses that lasted just a fraction too long, into the absence of the easy confidence that had been there before. Daniel leaned back slightly now, his earlier forward posture completely gone, replaced by something more restrained, more guarded, and I could see the shift not just in his body, but in his thinking, the careful recalibration of expectations that no longer felt as certain as they had moments ago. Emily's breathing had changed as well, shallow, controlled, her attention fixed on the lawyer, yet her awareness clearly divided. Part of her, still trying to follow the reading, part of her beginning to understand what it might mean. I sat quietly, composed, present, because this moment did not require interruption, it required completion. They needed to hear it fully, to understand it fully, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize that this was not something that could be undone with explanation or dismissed with assumption. As the lawyer reached the end of the section, his voice returning to its earlier steadiness, I felt a calm settle over me once more, Not because anything had been resolved, but because everything had been set in motion exactly as it needed to be. They had come expecting certainty. What they found instead was accountability. And in that difference, subtle as it may seem, the balance of everything had already begun to change. The lawyer lowered his gaze briefly to the final pages in front of him, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but deliberate, as if he understood that what came next would not simply be heard, but felt, and I recognized that shift instantly, the same way I had recognized every other subtle change that had unfolded in that room. Because once you begin to see clearly, you cannot unsee what has already revealed itself. There is one final provision, he said, his voice calm, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and I felt the attention in the room sharpen immediately. Daniel's posture tightening once more, Emily's breath catching just slightly, both of them leaning into the moment they had been waiting for, though not in the way they had imagined. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply listened. All primary assets, the lawyer continued, including liquid accounts, property holdings, and business interests, have been transferred into a protected trust structure, effective immediately upon Mr. Whitmore's passing. The words settled slowly, deliberately, and I watched as Daniel's expression shifted, not all at once, but in stages, first confusion, then calculation, then something closer to disbelief, as if the outcome he had been certain of was quietly dissolving in front of him. Emily turned her head slightly toward him, her composure faltering in a way she could no longer conceal, her eyes searching his face for confirmation that she had misunderstood, that this was temporary, that there was still something left to. Secure. But he offered her nothing, not even a glance. The lawyer continued without pause. Control of this trust, he said, remains solely with Mrs. Whitmore, with full discretionary authority over all distributions, timing, and conditions. This time, the silence that followed was not subtle. It was immediate, absolute, the kind of silence that does not need to be acknowledged because it is already understood by everyone present. Daniel leaned back in his chair, not slowly, not carefully, but with a slight force that betrayed the loss of control he had worked so hard to maintain, his earlier composure now replaced by something far more uncertain, while Emily's hands, still resting on the table, trembled just enough to reveal what she could no longer hide. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because there was nothing in those words that surprised me. Not anymore. The lawyer adjusted the document slightly and continued, his voice steady as ever. Furthermore, any individual found to have engaged in actions inconsistent with the conditions previously outlined shall be permanently excluded from any future discretionary distributions. There it was. Not a warning, not a possibility. A conclusion already written, already established, already in motion. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but unmistakable, as if he were trying to steady himself, to regain something that had already slipped beyond his reach, and for the first time since we had entered that room, he looked directly at me. Not with confidence, not with certainty, but with something else entirely. Recognition. Emily followed his gaze, her eyes meeting mine for a brief, unguarded moment, and in that instant I saw it clearly, the realization settling in, the understanding that everything they had assumed, everything they had quietly planned, had been built on something they never truly possessed. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply held their gaze for a moment, long enough for the truth to settle fully between us, long enough for them to understand that nothing in this room had unfolded by accident. The lawyer closed the document gently, the soft sound marking the end of the reading, but not the end of what had been revealed. And as the room remained still, suspended in that quiet aftermath, I allowed myself one small, deliberate movement. I reached into my bag and withdrew the envelope I had carried with me since that morning, placing it carefully on the table in front of me without a word. I did not open it. I did not explain it. I simply let it rest there, its presence enough, its meaning already understood without needing to be spoken. Daniel's eyes dropped to it immediately, his expression tightening once more, while Emily's gaze followed, her uncertainty deepening into something she could no longer mask. I leaned back slightly in my chair then, finally allowing the smallest shift in my posture, not as a reaction, but as a conclusion, because this moment, this realization, did not require explanation. It required acceptance. And as I looked at them, both of them now fully aware of what had been said in emotion long before they ever took their seats at that table, I understood something with complete clarity. They had come here expecting to inherit a future. Instead, they had just witnessed it being taken completely out of their hands. I let the silence settle fully before I moved again, not out of hesitation, but because some moments deserve to unfold without interruption, and this was one of them, a moment where words would only weaken what had already become clear. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the envelope in front of me, his earlier confidence now replaced by something far more rigid, as if he were trying to hold together a version of reality that no longer existed, while Emily sat beside him, her composure unraveling in quiet, unmistakable ways, her shoulders slightly drawn inward, her gaze shifting between me, the envelope, and the now closed document on the table, as if searching for something that might restore what had just been lost. I did not rush. I did not explain. Instead, I placed my hand lightly over the envelope, not to claim it, but to acknowledge it, to anchor the moment in something tangible, something real, and then I looked at them, both of them, with a calm that no longer required effort. "I heard you," I said quietly, my voice steady, not raised, not sharpened, but clear enough that neither of them could pretend otherwise, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but final, like a door closing without sound. Daniel's expression shifted again, this time not with calculation, but with recognition, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to deny. And, for a brief second, he seemed almost unsure of how to respond, as if the words he had so easily whispered before no longer belonged to him in the same way. Emily's breath caught softly, her eyes widening just slightly as she turned toward him. Then back to me, the connection between them no longer as seamless as it had been when they first entered the room. I did not press further. I did not need to repeat what I had heard or explain how much of it I understood, because the truth has a way of standing on its own once it is acknowledged, and in that moment, it required nothing more from me. The lawyer remained silent, observing, his presence now secondary to what had unfolded between us, and I could feel the weight of the room shift once more, not toward anticipation, not toward uncertainty, but toward something quieter, something more settled. Acceptance, perhaps, though not the kind they had expected. I removed my hand from the envelope and gently slid it across the table, not toward them, but into the center where it rested between us all, a quiet marker of everything that had led to this point, everything that had been seen, understood, and addressed without the need for confrontation. Daniel finally leaned forward just slightly, his movement cautious now, measured in a way that revealed more than any confident gesture ever could. But he did not reach for it. Not yet. And I could see in that hesitation the realization that whatever control he believed he had was no longer his to claim. Emily remained still, her hands now resting in her lap, her fingers tightly intertwined, her gaze lowered, not out of respect, but out of something closer to understanding, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been done. I stood then, slowly, without urgency, allowing the chair to move back with a soft, controlled sound. And for a moment, no one else moved, as if the act itself had shifted the balance one final time. I adjusted my coat, smoothing it lightly at the front, a simple, familiar gesture. And then I looked at them once more, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that no longer required emotion to be understood. They had shown me exactly who they were when they believed I was, no longer paying attention. And in doing so, they had made every decision that followed not only necessary, but inevitable. I turned toward the door without another word, my steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying me further from the version of this family I had once believed in. And as I reached the threshold, I paused briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge, quietly and without regret, that some endings do not arrive with noise or conflict, but with a simple understanding that what once was no longer exists in the same way. Then I continued forward, leaving the room, the silence, and everything it contained behind me, knowing with complete certainty that while they had been waiting for something to be given, I'd already taken back everything that mattered.